All right. Hello, all you beautiful people. How you doing here? Chuck Holton, coming to you from the Maple Fork Lodge in southern West Virginia. And we got a lot to talk about today. I just wondered how many of you have ever been subject to rationing? Have you ever in your life gone to buy something and had somebody tell you, "I'm sorry, you can't have that." You've fulfilled your quota. You've already bought enough. You can't have any more. This is something Americans are not used to dealing with at all. And we're going to talk today about how that could be hamstringing us in terms of our adversarial relationship with China. See, we're used to getting everything we want, when we want it, how we want it, exactly customized immediately, if not before. And the problem with that is that most of that, a lot of those products come from China. The Chinese, on the other hand, are inured to hardship, and this is going to play into any future conflict between our two countries. So, we're going to talk more about it. Now, yeah, toilet paper during COVID, you're right. That's for those people who are still so backwards as to use toilet paper instead of a bidet or a sprayer. I think those are much cleaner and more hygienic. But so let's talk about kind of where we came from and the biggest threat that we face from China. Now, there's a silver lining to this cloud, so you're going to want to stick around to the end because I've got good news at the end, or at least not quite so bad news. And I'm going to try to make this fast. We may go for an hour, but because there's a lot to get to. But if I get right into it, maybe we can crank this out in less. Okay. So, okay, consider me backwards. Okay, you're backwards. Uh, now, during World War II, Americans on the home front faced a range of material and economic hardships due to massive mobilization of resources we had for the war effort. Is one of the only times in our history, with the possible exception of the Civil War, when we were completely mobilized as a nation to win a war. Because for us, it was an existential conflict. And that's about the only time that we had faced something like that, where we had been attacked on our home soil. Now, what I'm talking about in terms of the hardships we faced are things like the rationing of goods, sugar, meat, butter, coffee, canned goods. Everything was rationed. Every family received ration books with coupons that limited their consumption. Gasoline and tires was strictly rationed. Rubber shortages made tires hard to come by, even if you could buy them. And then what that did is limited travel. It limited the transport that it takes to get products to market. And so people had to either go without, maybe carpool, ride a bike. This was something that was much more normal and accepted back then, obviously. Even clothing was prioritized for military use. And so there's actually a whole, I don't know what you would call it, a fashion trend that took place during World War II that was like simplified fashion, where if they normally would put 6 buttons on the front of your shirt, they only put 3, or they did away with the cuffs altogether on shirts and things like that. That simplified fashion was simply because cotton and wool and leather and things like that were being prioritized for military use. Now, if you wanted to buy a refrigerator during World War II, good luck. you couldn't get one, or a car, or even something like a typewriter. You couldn't get that stuff because those factories had been repurposed and converted to military production. And on top of all that, there was a booming black market for things that you either weren't uh, authorized to purchase or that just were so scarce that people snapped them up and then turned around and resold them. The Office of Price Administration back then imposed price controls on um, many essential goods to prevent the inflation that would have naturally taken place during wartime. There were, of course, labor shortages, the same as what we're seeing in Russia right now. Millions of men, there were 16 million men under arms during World War II. So, millions of men that left their civilian jobs to join the military led to a labor force shortage that in part was filled by women and older, people coming out of retirement to fill the gap. And that led to housing shortages around important military facilities and factories in the big cities because they were so overcrowded because everything was turned up to 11 that there wasn't enough housing for everybody. So temporary housing, even tent housing or trailer parks became more common in some of these boom towns, I guess you might call it. Of course, taxes went up. Americans were encouraged uh, to voluntarily pay higher taxes by buying war bonds. Of course, war bonds was one of the biggest ways that the U.S. was able to finance the war, and that took more disposable income away from consumer spending. So there was less to buy and less money to buy it with. Then, of course, there was the victory gardens phenomenon where people were encouraged to go out in their front yards and plant vegetables for your own consumption. Citizens were asked to donate any extra metal or rubber or even paper, cooking fat for the war effort. And of course, travel and leisure, many forms of recreation were just not possible because of the importance of conserving fuel and that sort of thing. So, all of that to say, Americans endured significant inconvenience, to say the least, even sacrifice during World War II. And that's part of why America won World War II, because World War II was essentially a contest of industry over military. Now, the military was the pointy end of the battle, but the battle was actually won through Americans just producing more stuff than our adversaries. We were able to outproduce everybody. Well, that's no longer the case. Ask yourself, do you think Americans today would be willing to go through the hardships and inconvenience that Americans did during World War II? You might say, well, yes, I would be happy to stand up and do my duty to the country. But okay, you might, but do you think most people would be willing to forego that new purchase, pay higher taxes, uh, curtail their travel plans, uh, ration fuel, and uh, not be able to get many goods? Do you think they would voluntarily do that? I'm skeptical. Perhaps if Americans could be made to see that we do face another existential crisis, then they would be more willing to do something like that. But I think most Americans, eh, if you're less than 80 years old, you don't you've never known a time when there was an existential threat, a looming, like real, on your doorstep existential threat to America. Now we had 9/11, we had the 2020 sickness, but those were not existential threats to our country. We we've had 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, but that's was accomplished with 500,000 men under arms, not 16 million men under arms. And nobody in America was asked to forego anything. I remember being in Afghanistan one time. I was on a remote Marine Corps fob, and there was a sign somebody had tacked to the wall in the barracks that said, America is not at war. The Marine Corps is at war. America is at the mall. And that was the kind of normal sentiment over there uh, from people that were fighting that war, right? Leviathan asks, Chuck, any update on North Korea's failed ship launch a week ago? And was that ship actually a threat or just theatrics? Well, I mean, it was a real ship and it did sink. I mean, capsized. And I'm sure a lot of people lost their jobs or important parts of their body because of that. It was very embarrassing for North Korea. And that does sort of tie into what I'm going to be talking about here today. So I'll come back to that in just a little bit in terms of the quality of the materiel, the military hardware and stuff that China, North Korea, Iran, Russia are cranking out, and how that compares to American stuff. But let's start by explaining that China, all of that World War II characterization of rationing and inconvenience is currently the norm in China. China is buckling down, so to speak, to prepare for war. War with the West, and more importantly, war with the United States. And whether or not you think it'll actually ever happen, the truth is that the Chinese are planning for it to happen. And so we should take this seriously. Now, China is undergoing a massive military modernization and expansion program across the board in its military. They already have the largest military in the world, more than 2 million men under arms, largest standing army on planet Earth. They are shooting now for naval supremacy on the high seas. They are rapidly expanding their navy. They're producing warships. Now, you get this. The United States, in the last 5 years, built 57 ships. Okay, that's total ships, commercial and uh, military. The Chinese are building about 1,500 ships a year, more than 200 times as many ships as the United States. They are rapidly expanding their navy, producing warships at a rate that is nearly 3 times that of the United States, including advanced aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. Now they haven't caught up with us yet. The United States has 12 carrier battle groups and China only has 4, but at the rate they're going, they are catching up fast. I'm going to show you some graphs here in a minute from a Washington Post article. I think it's Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, maybe. China is vastly increasing their air and missile capabilities. The deployment of their H-6 bombers to islands, these contested islands out in the South Pacific and the South China Sea. And the development of long-range missiles are meant to enhance their power projection ability. They're also increasing their nuclear arsenal to more than 600 nuclear warheads. That's disconcerting. Projections are that they'll reach 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030, but if we even make it that far, because they're planning on going to war by 2027. We'll talk more about that in a minute. They are engaging in something they call strategic stockpiling. So they're mobilizing economic resources in order to be prepared for war, amassing massive reserves of things like oil, metal, different kinds of metals, grain, copper, iron, and all of that is to mitigate any potential sanctions or supply chain disruptions that might happen during a conflict. They are also upgrading, let's say, their financial system to try to move away more from Western financial networks, the SWIFT networks. They've seen what has happened to Russia with the sanctions that have been levied against them in the financial realm. And so China is moving away from Western financial networks altogether, coming up with their digital version of renminbi currency to counteract any potential economic sanctions. They have vastly increased their uh, cyber warfare capabilities and space. They come up with a cyber space force now to rival America's space force. And these guys are already conducting offensive operations. This is one realm of battle where the war is already underway. There's a hot war in cyberspace between American and Chinese hackers. The Chinese are engaging in something called Volt Typhoon, which is a infiltration strategy to place what they call zero-day exploits inside American critical infrastructure, dams, bridges, power networks, different, electrical networks, communications nodes, things like that. And those zero-day exploits are basically like a hidden switch inside the software that runs these pieces of infrastructure that China has the ability to flip. And so war breaks out, China flips all those switches, opens up all the dams in America, turns off all the electricity in America. I mean, that's what they're trying to prepare themselves to be able to do. So I'm not saying that they are quite there yet, but beyond a shadow of a doubt, they already have a lot of zero-day exploits in critical infrastructure nodes in the United States. Just waiting. And there are like competitions out there. The government will actually pay hackers to find these zero-day exploits so that they can close those loops. But there's an arms race there too, because there are other actors, state and non-state actors around the world who will pay more than the US government for those very same exploits. And so you would have to rely on the national pride, patriotism, and goodwill of hackers to turn over those exploits to the US government instead of making 5 times as much money by turning them over to Iran or North Korea or China. That's concerning. Now, in China today, if you build a new building, all of the new buildings have to have a bomb shelter in urban areas. That is not happening in the United States. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why Ukraine has been able to hold out for so long against the onslaught of the Russians, and one of the reasons why the death toll in Israel has been so low, aside from the Iron Dome system, is the fact that in both places, Israel and Ukraine, there are, sorry, I got a piece of sawdust in my eye. There are underground shelters almost everywhere in both of those countries. In Kyiv, it's the metro system, which doubles as a shelter system. And most apartment complexes, apartment buildings in Kyiv and all across Ukraine have bomb shelters in the basement. They were built that way to protect Ukrainians from an American nuclear strike during the Soviet Union, the time that that Ukraine belonged to the Soviet Union. But strangely enough, they've now come in handy to protect people against attacks from Russia. It certainly was not planned. So suffice it to say that China has been making multifaceted preparations with a strategic focus on war with the West and enhancing their military capabilities in advance of any conflict. They are indeed gearing up in a major way. Now, that's the bad news. Good news for China, bad news for us. One other thing is the Chinese, you should go watch a very amusing video by my friend Chris Cappy about the new Pentagon, so to speak, military command center that China is building just outside of Beijing. It's called a military city, and it's 10 times bigger than our Pentagon. It's the biggest one in the world. It's more than 1,500 acres, and it goes deep, deep underground. And they are planning to be able to house, could be up to millions of people underground for an extended period of time. So I would love to get in there and see that. I mean, just imagine an underground system of tunnels and bunkers big enough to house 3 million people. I mean, that's just mind-boggling. How does that even work? But holy cow. Now, one could look at all of those preparations and easily come to the conclusion China is definitely planning to go to war. And I think that's a fair statement. They are definitely planning for war. However, they have some points of friction, let's say, things that are slowing them down somewhat, and that could actually cause China to collapse before it could actually go to war with the United States. So I want to go through some of those things. First of all, they have this massive property sector crisis. The vast majority of Chinese internal investment, personal investment, does not go into a stock market. It does not go into mutual funds. It does not go into 401k. It goes into property. That's because the Chinese government mandated that the only thing you could invest in would be real assets. Why? Because it boosts the economy when people invest in real assets, when people are buying houses and stuff. And so it was a way to sort of artificially inflate the economy in China. But the problem with that is they overbuilt to such a massive extent that somebody did a study and said if you put a family of 3 in every empty house or apartment in China today, China could house an extra 3 billion people. That means they've got approximately 4 times the number of housing units that they need for their own population. And they don't accept a lot of migrants in China. So migration to China, not really a thing. That's why they have entire towns. I mean, not towns, cities, big cities that are just ghost towns. They're empty. You see videos coming out on social media of them demolishing entire, neighborhoods of brand new, sometimes not even finished construction because they've so overbuilt. So the major developers in China, called Evergrande and Country Garden, have both defaulted on their loans, and that has triggered kind of a slow motion collapse in the real estate market that has on a scale that's never been seen before in history. I mean, it's really insane. Real estate represents about 30% of China's GDP. And so that sector imploding affects everything: consumer confidence, local tax base, banks, it's just massive across China. So now you got to balance these two in your mind, and it's kind of hard to do. But you have to keep in mind that I'm going to go through here and show you that China has some very serious systemic and economic problems that could and likely will eventually lead to its absolute demise. I mean, like, China will cease to exist as a nation at some point in the not too distant future. And that's really just a matter of arithmetic. We'll talk more about the demographics in a minute, but it's just a matter of arithmetic. It's like China is going to collapse and cease to exist, just like Russia, because they're just not having babies. But there are a lot more things that are happening besides that are negatively weighing on the economy of China. But at the same time, you have to balance that in your mind with the fact that China, the people of China are able to accept a much lower standard of living. They're able to accept a much higher level of hardship than Americans are. They just have a much higher pain tolerance than Americans do. And so even though these things, if you applied them to the United States, we'd be in absolute zombie apocalypse by now. And I don't think we're far from that as it is. But because China is an authoritarian state, the government could just come tell you, guess what? You're not getting paid anymore. Or guess what? You're moving out of your house and we're going to demolish it tomorrow to build a new freeway or a military base or something like that. And so that gives them a level of sort of cultural and systemic agility that the United States just doesn't possess, because we're Americans. We do what we want. Nobody to tell us what to do. So now the collapse of the real estate market in China has led to a debt crisis with local government. Local government relied on taxes from land sales for its revenue. So as that dries up, those local governments then have to go out and borrow money to do their thing. It's estimated that China's local government debt, exceeds $10 trillion. So it's very likely, like I said, it's almost just an arithmetic reality that, or mathematical reality, that there will be a mass defaults across China at some point in the near future. Of course, China's growth is slowing with the trade war, especially. There's a lot of companies that are pulling out of China altogether that were doing business over there, but now it's just too politically fraught with risk. So they're pulling out. Growth in China has slowed to well below the rates that they had in the past. Now it's averaging 3-4%. The youth unemployment rate in China, it got so bad they just quit counting it in 2023. Like nobody even knows what it is now. It was over 20% when they quit counting. That's massive. And as I said, the capital flight and the collapse of foreign direct investment is huge. As China pulls away and tries to form its own financial networks and things like that, that leads to them essentially decoupling or divorcing themselves from the EU and the United States. So, and there's just too much risk to invest in China these days if you're a Westerner. And so people are just stopping doing that. China has not been able to update its infrastructure since about the early 2000s. I'm talking about roads, bridges, other, critical infrastructure. And they are an exceedingly dirty population. The country produces more carbon, more greenhouse gases, greenhouse emissions than the rest of the world combined at this point. They are heavily dependent on coal and oil imports to keep all those furnaces burning and spewing, greenhouse gases into the air. So, if there's any kind of disruption in the flow of coal and oil from around the world, China is going to be in very rough straits very quickly. And that, of course, describes what would happen during wartime if they did go to war. Now, China also, I've mentioned before, is facing an unbelievable population decline. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting video from Peter Zeihan talking about how more than 100 million people disappeared from China. 100 million, a third of the United States. Actually, he said it could be as high as 500 million. 500 million people that existed on paper but don't actually exist, as it turns out. The reason for that is because the way things work in the Chinese government is the local governments, let's say like a hospital gets paid from the government based on the number of babies that are born in that hospital. And so what they would do is they would overcount the number of babies, sometimes by a lot, in order to get more money. Well, then the same thing would happen with, voter rolls or school rolls. The school gets a certain amount of money per pupil. So they would create all these phantom pupils in order to get more money. And so China's official census statistics are way off and could be between 10 and 30%, 40% less people in China than everybody thinks. That's amazing. But on top of that, China's population shrunk for the first time in 60 years in 2023. China's fertility rate is about 1.09, which is obviously about half of what the replacement level would be, 2.1. China has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. Over 30% of China's population will be over 60 years old by 2035. And that right there is a serious drain on productivity and healthcare. You have a large, what they call pension overhang, where there's people who are collecting a pension and fewer people paying the money that is going to pay those pensions. Of course, we're facing something similar here in the United States, but not near to that scale. China's one-child policy means that there are 30 million more men than women in China. Makes it a little hard to breed that way. And 30 million men without spouses could easily lead to, just a very serious unrest, volatile times in China, because you got a lot of guys that are unable to go out and find a wife. They're more prone to unrest. Let's put it that way. So the question is, could these negative things hamper or help China? Could it make it more likely or less likely that China will actually go to war against the West by trying to take Taiwan sometime between now and 2027? Well, it could hamper their war efforts, obviously, because of the aging population and declining domestic consumption and weak exports reduces the number of resources that are available for war. As I showed you, though, China is making up for that by stockpiling stuff now. Even, it's interesting. You should go read the book by my friend Ryan Macbeth called The Wayback Machine. And in the book, it talks about uh, this these investors in the United States realizing that, oh, there's about to be a war because, China's about to go to war because how do we know that? Because the number of pork bellies that they're buying from overseas and shipping into China, and they're using it to create canned spam. Well, Chinese don't traditionally, spam is not a part of their diet, but it's true that if you travel to those areas, you will find spam being used in more and more dishes. As a matter of fact, when we were in Guam, there was everywhere you went, you could get uh, spam sushi. Now that's Japanese, not Chinese, but still, it's like, what? That's spam's not typically part of the Japanese diet either, but it's becoming more and more popular over there. And that's because the Chinese are trying to get their people accustomed to eating canned meat, because in wartime they may not have the ability to raise fresh meat, right? China lags in technology, and so that's another thing that might hinder them from being able to go to war. The sanctions against China and the decoupling that we talked about earlier could cut China off from the real cutting edge Western tech that is required to compete militarily in cyberspace and elsewhere, in AI and things like that. And of course, a population that is struggling economically is going to be less likely to support war. And so, that could be a drag on their plans for wartime, for a war against the West as well. However, all of the above could also serve as an incentive for war, because Xi Jinping could care less about the suffering of his people. And he might look at it this way and say a short, decisive war over Taiwan, it would be a great way to rally nationalism in China and get people behind the CCP, distract them from their economic woes, and lock in Xi Jinping's legacy, which I would say the latter of those is the most important to him. And also, as these pressures mount economically, demographically, and so on, China might lash out and decide, if we're going to have a war, if we're going to retake Taiwan, this is our only window. Now's our only shot, because in 10 years, we're not going to have enough people to do it. They're starting to collapse. So the bottom line is that China's economic and demographic decay is accelerating, and it's very real. Now, it could constrain China's ability to fight a long, drawn out, high tech war, but it could make the regime more dangerous in the short term. And that's something that we need to be concerned about. Now, I see some questions here. Do you think the assassination on Putin was real, or was it them trying to seem sympathetic? I don't know. I haven't read too much about the rumored assassination attempt on Putin, but I know that he took it seriously because they really ramped up their attacks on Ukraine immediately after that happened. Um, is that angry? Angie says, is that why they want Taiwan to catch up on technology innovation? Well, Taiwan is the leading edge of technology innovation, and that's why China wants it. There are the machines that make the ultra high tech computer chips that are required for advanced microelectronics, cell phones, missiles, things like that. In the like 4 nanometer range, I believe, those are only available with equipment that is built by Taiwan. Now, some of the manufacturing of the chips themselves happens in the United States now, but much of it takes place in Taiwan itself. China, on the other hand, has a real hard time manufacturing any microchips themselves that are sub 10 nanometer, which is nowhere. I mean, that's years and years behind the rest of the world. So they need that. They don't have time to catch up technologically, and they're not good at innovation. The Chinese have anything they have technologically was stolen from somebody in the West. They have decided that it's just much easier to steal technology than it is to create it themselves. I've often said that the national motto in China should be, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. If you get caught, you're not trying hard enough. So China's not going to be able to innovate its way out of that problem. And so they see their only option as militarily taking over China, getting their hands on those advanced electronics and using them for, to affect global domination. Golly, I got sawdust in my eye. Now, Taiwan is adopting a porcupine defense, so to speak, trying to make cheap weapons that can destroy China's expensive weapons and essentially make it so militarily costly for China. I mean, Taiwan knows it can't hold out against China forever, but they can make it extremely costly for China, just like Ukraine is doing for Russia. And so that's Taiwan's defense, in addition to the relationships that they have with the United States to come to their aid, right? Now, Angie says, so Taiwan is their goal. Yes, Taiwan is definitely China's goal right now. I think Chuck was making excuses, but I saw those photos of those Holton men doing work. I'm not sure what you mean by excuses. Mr. Pibb? No, this is water. I don't drink sodas. Do you think China might, Hopke says, do you think China might take advantage of the chaos of an Iran war and go for Taiwan? Or are they looking for more strategic timing? China is encouraging the mayhem and shenanigans that are happening around the world. Russia, uh, Iran, even Venezuela. Because the more things that the United States has got its finger in, the fewer assets the United States has to bring to bear against China. Now, the United States, we had this big blow up over Panama at the beginning of the Trump administration. And that has largely died down, but the issue is still there. The real issue is not that China controls the canal, they don't, but that China manages the ports, two of the 5 ports in Panama. And those ports give China a wealth of data and information about what is flowing where around the world, including US military movements. And if we wanted to, for example, build up forces or build up our capabilities in Diego Garcia, a lot of the everyday items that have to be shipped over there, chicken and boots and stuff like that, medical supplies, they all get shipped via commercial shipping, and a lot of that goes through these ports. And China gets access to the manifests and what's going through there, and so they can start to put together a picture of what the United States is planning, and it affects our operational security. So it's still a big issue that Hutchison Group is controlling those ports, and not just those ports. They control more than 40 ports around the world in 24 countries, including at the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz and the English Channel. So that's an issue that Trump beat his drum about very vigorously at the beginning of his term and has now sort of moved on from. But not much has happened to fix that problem. Now, some people might say, well, I read that Hutchison was going to sell those ports in Panama to BlackRock. That sale has been blocked now by the Chinese Communist government. So it's not happening. It's not going to happen. And that means that the problem still exists. Amble says, anyway, my country have Typhoon missiles on the northern portion facing CCP. Okay. That's not a question, but all right. Chuck, when done, rinse your eyes out with water. Thank you. Yeah, no, I was out putting a roof on our bathroom addition to one of our little cabins today, and I got lots of sawdust in my face. And I really should have just been wearing goggles, but I was too lazy to go get some. Question, Mama Marissa says, if China were to attack the U.S., would that seal their demise since we are their largest consumer? Not necessarily, because if they were to attack America and take over, if they were to win that conflict, then they could force America to buy even more from China. We can force America to buy everything from China. So it's, of course, not likely that they would actually be able to take over America. That's, there've been movies made about that. It's almost ridiculous to think, just with the number of guns here in West Virginia. They're not going to take over West Virginia, I promise you that. So, but there are people in China that are talking that way. Chinese ads interrupting the live stream. That's funny. You ought to click on those ads just to cost those advertisers money. If you get an ad for, helping kids in Gaza or, that sort of things, helping Syria, just click on the ad so it'll cost them money and don't buy anything. Okay, so I'm gonna end it there because I still got a lot of work to do, and it's gonna start raining here pretty quick. So Rico says, Chuck, do you think China will try taking Taiwan while in negotiations with the U.S.? And do they have the money due to their economic situation? Um, I would just say go back. Maybe you came in late, Rico. I think everything I've said in this broadcast has been the answer to that question. Have you heard of the Kinmen County in Taiwan? It's right next to the mainland. Look it up. No, I haven't. I've been to Taiwan. How do you think North Korea's Navy is doing? Yeah, not great. I heard that they're putting glass bottoms in the new Korean Navy so that they can see the old North Korean Navy when they go to sea. Uh, okay. Yeah, I did see your question, Mama Marissa. I think I got to it, unless you asked a different one. All right. Well, thank you for the Wellness Company ad there. They're not sponsoring today's broadcast, but they are real happy with you guys because apparently a lot of you have been going to the Wellness Company's website right there in the chat. Mama Marissa wrote, put it down, twc.health/hot zone. If you go to twc.health/hot zone, you can get a discount on their uh, products, and a lot of people are going for that. So, um, thank you for supporting our sponsors. That that's good for us and good for them and good for you. All right. God bless you all. Have a good day. Thank you very much.